Church. My name is David Baxley. I'm one of the pastors here at Bethany. It's so good to see you. So this week is our last week as we go through our parable series. We've been hanging out in parables throughout the summer. It's been really nice, and this is our last week. So one last time, let's just look at the definition of a parable. Read this with me. A parable is a short, engaging story meant to illustrate something important to God. You know, one of the things that parables were meant to do was to help us see the true condition of our hearts, to help to maybe expose the things that we believe, the things we think, or the things that we feel that maybe we haven't been able to fully see within ourselves. And as I was thinking about this, I've realized the older I get, the more I realize I can't really see what's going on in my heart really well. I'm not the best judge of what's really happening inside of me all that often. But Jesus told parables to help his listeners see things in their heart, in themselves, that they maybe have not been able to see up to this point. And so turn with me to Luke 18. It's in Luke 18 this morning. Luke 18, we're going to be for our final parable. And I read this week, a recent poll that came out. And in this poll, they were asking the questions. They were wanting to know, what did people think about the goodness of people? What did they think about the goodness of humanity? And so they asked several questions, and the result of those questions was that 81% of the people polled said they believe humanity is inherently good. 81% said that humanity is inherently good. 75% of the people surveyed believed that they themselves are good. 75% of the people surveyed said, I am a good person. And then half of those people said that not only are they a good person, they are the best person that they know. True story. They said, yes, comparatively, I am the best person I know compared to everyone else in my life right now. And as I read through this, my first thought was, how do they even know they're good? How do they know what is good? And as I was thinking about this, I realized the poll kind of answered that question for us. People instinctively, what they do is they define their standard of good by comparing themselves to others. That's how they figure out if they're good. Yet if we start to think about this for a moment, we might realize how dangerous this is, how even risky this is if we really want to know who we are, trying to define ourselves by what we see just in people around us. How are we going to really know the condition of our own lives, our own hearts? And in the parable this morning, Jesus wanted to help people see what was really happening in their hearts. And so in Luke 18, we begin with this summary. This is how Luke summarized the parable Jesus was about to give. In verse 9, Luke 18, verse 9, it says this, and he, Jesus, told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and looked down on everyone else. And it turns out that if you had taken that same poll that I was referencing, we would find out that the exact same results probably existed among Jesus' listeners. People thought they were good. Not only did they think they were good, but as they looked around and even started to compare themselves to people around them, they believed that they were good in the eyes of God, that God must be happy with them, pleased with them. And Luke described this perception they had by saying that they thought they were righteous. And so I want us to pause just for a moment and kind of ask that question. What does it mean to be righteous? Because righteous is one of those words that we may find it in like a church context, we may find it when we're reading the Bible, but it's not necessarily a word that we experience or use every day in life. But the root of the word righteous actually was a word that Jesus' audience would have been using every day, because it simply spoke to the idea of being conformed to a standard that's been set. Righteous was the idea of just conforming to whatever standard had been set. And so in the context of what Jesus is doing with this parable, we might best understand that righteousness is having met God's standard for what is good, making us acceptable to God. And I want us to hold on to that definition this morning. Having met God's standard for what is good, making us acceptable to God. Because Jesus was telling this parable to expose the way many people, those listening to him at this moment, wrongly thought about what made them righteous to God. So start with me in verse 10. We're going to read this parable. It's a short one. Start with me in verse 10 this morning. And Jesus told this parable. It went like this. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee was standing and praying like this about himself. God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, greedy, unrighteous, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of everything I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but kept striking his chest and saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And I tell you, this one went down to his house justified rather than the other. Because everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. And so as we read this parable, I think in order for us to really understand what Jesus was doing and what he was trying to help his original audience understand, for us even today, we need to look closely at the people, the characters of this story, to understand who they were in the context of Jesus' listeners. So Jesus first tells us about this Pharisee. Now here's the thing, I say the word Pharisee. For those, if you grew up in the church, and for those that might be familiar with that term or that name, for most of us, it might be something that we already have this like negative view about. Because if you're just familiar with the story of like the Good Samaritan, you remember that the Pharisee is the bad guy. He's the guy that walks past the person bleeding and suffering, wounded on the side of the road. And so we already have this view of him right there. And even in our own lingo today, one of the things that we do, we often might use the word Pharisee to describe someone who's really judging, judgmental, condemning, someone we may perceive as being really self-righteous. But that was not at all the perception for Jesus' audience. The first listeners of this story, that's not how they saw a Pharisee. In the minds of the original listeners, as Jesus begins to talk about a Pharisee, he's describing to them a spiritual leader that they aspired to be like. And so if we want to kind of bring it into our context, if we want to understand what they thought of a Pharisee, it might be a Pharisee was a pastor that they love, that you love. Or it might be a spiritual mentor, someone that you look up to and that you aspire to be like or want to be like. Maybe it's someone you look in the church and you see they're really committed to the church. And not only that, someone that you know knows their Bible, and you respect how they know their Bible. Maybe they've studied it, maybe they've gone to school, and you appreciate it so much that, in fact, if you have questions about God or questions about the Bible, this is probably someone you're going to go to and ask. So for his audience, when he begins to talk about a Pharisee, he's talking about a religious hero. He's talking about someone that they want to be like. And this is greatly contrasted against the other person in Jesus' story, the tax collector. So if we want to just consider what would they think of when we think tax collector, for us, maybe all I have to say is IRS audit. And you're all like, let's get them, let's go, let's on it, we're on it. But see, actually, when Jesus said tax collector, there was so much more he was saying. It was actually much, much, much worse. Because the tax collector, he was one of your neighbors. He's one of your friends who had chosen to side with the violent Roman force occupying your country. And the way he sided with the Romans was by being the collector of the taxes that they were charging you as his occupying force. And not only that, but as you watch them, they use that position of power to swindle people that were suffering under the oppression of this occupying force. They use their power to get rich for themselves. And if we want to understand it for maybe our day, a tax collector would have been viewed much like you would have viewed a Nazi collaborator. Think of what a Nazi collaborator was. Nazis come in, and the collaborator is one that works with the very force that is gunning down men, women, and children in the streets. That's how they would have saw the tax collector in this story. And so when you consider this, knowing Jesus' original audience, how they would have saw a Pharisee versus how they would have saw a tax collector, as we get into this parable, it makes what Jesus is doing very scandalous. It makes the things he's saying feel very controversial because it contradicts the viewpoints that they would have had about both of these people, especially when it comes to their relationship with God. And so Jesus, he's building on this tension, starting with their prayers. And I want us just to look at the prayers offered in this parable for a moment. First, let's look at the Pharisee's prayer. Look what he says. He says, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, greedy, unrighteous, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of everything that I get. And I want us to pull back for a moment. I want us just to look at what he says. Because at first glance, when you just see the things that he says, you realize he's saying things that are right. In fact, we'd look at him and say, apparently he's not a greedy guy. He's a guy that's faithful in his marriage. He's not a collaborator. He's not violently oppressing the people, his neighbors, or his friends. In fact, he's one that seems to follow spiritual disciplines like fasting and prayer, and he's committed to giving his money to God. So if you just look at this list, if I look at this list, if I'm really honest, these are things I want to say about myself. Don't you? But then look at the second prayer of the tax collector. This is what he prays. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And at this point, there's not much of this prayer. In fact, when you consider what they knew about this man, even how we have kind of talked about him, this collaborator with this violent force, at this point, when you see that prayer, God, have mercy on me, you might be looking and saying, that's what you should be doing. You should be begging for mercy. The type of person that you are, oh my goodness, you better do that, but you don't deserve it, and I hope you don't get it. Because look what this guy has done. You might believe he's going to get what he deserves. But see, the parable is ultimately, it's not about what they prayed. The parable is ultimately not about what they prayed, but about the condition of their hearts as they prayed. See, between both these men, we have two different perspectives. And their perspectives are different than each other, both in how they saw themselves, and they're different in how they saw God. And it's seen in the comparisons that they actually make in their prayers. Look at this. The Pharisee's perspective is seen as he begins to compare himself to other people. He has a high view of himself because his definition of what makes him righteous before God is based on how he compares the good he does to the evil he sees other people do. He finds himself to be righteous by comparing what he does to the unrighteous things people do. He validates himself, reminding God of the sins that other people are doing. Lord, look at all these things they're doing. I don't do these things, God. But not only that, then he keeps going, and then he builds on that, and he makes sure God sees all the things he is doing. God, look at all the things I'm also doing right. And here's what happens. When this is how we evaluate ourselves, when we evaluate our righteousness like this, we've got to recognize we're going to always look good. We're going to always look good. If I were to compare myself to someone that murdered someone else, I'm always going to look good. I don't know if you know this, I've never murdered somebody before. If I was to compare myself to a drunk, I can make myself look good. I've never been drunk before. You know, each of us, though, we can create that list. All of us have the list, the things that I don't do that other people do. The things that I haven't done that I watch and see other people do. But when we do this, what happens in this moment is it creates a smoke screen around our hearts. And what happens is we can't see into our own hearts the reality of our own sinful condition. We can't see the things that are really happening inside of our hearts, our own sinful things, because we're busy focusing on the things, the sin, the motivations that we think are in other people's hearts. That has our attention. Why would I want to look at my own life when I can start out looking at others? And it's really natural. In fact, I have fallen for this trap so many times. And sadly, the worst place I have done this is in my marriage. See, what happens is, especially early on, I would get hurt and I'd get upset. And what I would do is I would begin to justify what I'm feeling. I would begin to justify what I may be thinking in this moment by reminding myself of what I think Amy does that I don't do. Have you ever done that? Of course not. You guys are better. All right. But I do this. And I would begin to justify myself in that way. And then as I started to do that, I would maybe also, like the Pharisee, I'd count the things that I did. Here's the list of the things I know I'm doing right. And then what would happen in my own mind, I would create this completely biased list of comparisons. And I can remember early on in my hurt just foolishly fuming. And as I'm fuming, I'm just reinforcing my idea of my righteousness in my mind as I've done all these comparisons. But what I've realized is these comparisons are utterly divorced of reality. Because when we start really trying to compare ourselves to others when it comes to sin, it's always divorced of reality. Every single time. But it made me feel good in the moment. But what it was an absolutely self-created lie. And God would end up spending years just really confronting me on that in my life and in my own heart, what I was doing. But the problem is this way of thinking that it can be so natural for us, it reinforces one of the biggest lies that our culture around us embraces. You remember the poll? 81% believe that humanity is basically good. If you had to pick, they're good. Not only that, 75% said they are good. And so when you believe that, when we believe that our goodness is going to be defined by comparing ourselves with others who in our eyes aren't good, or at least as that poll said, not as good as us, we're going to believe in our goodness every single time. We always win. It's easy. But our goodness, our righteousness is not to be compared with others. If we want to know who we really are, our goodness, it's about who we are compared to God. How He defines what is good. What goodness looks like in God's eyes. In the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul, he's reminding us of this, of what God sees in chapter 3. And he says this, kind of a summary of several verses here. It says, there was no one righteous, not even one. All have turned away. There is no one who does what is good, not even one. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So when we say all have sinned, we are saying that in our sins, each of us equally fall short of the definition of goodness and righteousness in the eyes of God. We're saying that our sin breaks our relationship with God and that we cannot do enough good. There is not enough good we could ever do in this world to, on our own, make our relationship right with God. And this is what the tax collector understood. It changed, it impacted how he prayed and how he came to God. Look how Jesus described him in verse 13. Jesus said, but the tax collector, standing far off, he wouldn't even raise his eyes to heaven. But he kept striking his chest and saying, God, have mercy. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. You know, the problem is that this has kind of been twisted and used in a different way today. But see, for Jesus' audience, when he said this, they would have recognized that in their culture, when a Jewish person would beat their chest, they were trying to say something. They were saying, "I'm beating my heart because my heart is the root of all my evil. It's all me." And so as the tax collector, he beats his chest and he acknowledges to God the state of his evil before God. And he understands what Paul was describing just in this verse in Romans just before, that he couldn't be good enough. He understands that he has no grounds to stand with God, to receive anything from God except maybe punishment for what he's done. And he realizes at that moment that apart from God's mercy, unless God somehow intervenes, that there is no hope of being acceptable to God. But that's where the story can turn good, because God intervened. This is what God did. Look how Jesus closed this part of the parable. Luke 18, verse 14. Look what he said. He said, "I tell you, this one," the tax collector, "went down to his house justified rather than the other," rather than the Pharisee. "Because everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted." See, in this story, it's really simple. There's two men, and there's two perspectives with two very different standings with God at the end. The tax collector, he was the one who was justified before God. But see, justified, it can be another one of those words like righteous. So I just want to summarize what Jesus was saying here. When he said he was justified, simply what he meant was to be justified means that they have been made right with God. He's saying the tax collector was one that was been made right with God. See, justification is a work of God. It's a work that God does in us so that we may be made righteous. We may be made right with God. It's a work that God does in us to bring us to a right standing before God. And so when the tax collector, when he began to compare himself to God instead of other people, it redefined his response to God. And it redefined his response to people. It brought him to a place of humility. He was humbled. He was asking God to do something that he knew he couldn't do himself. And as we read this parable, we read the same is true for us. When we correctly compare ourselves to God instead of other people, we will see the reality of the sin that we have seriously committed against God. We will see that our sin makes us unrighteous before God. And it doesn't matter how we think we are compared to someone else anymore, because we realize every sin breaks God's standards of righteousness. But then we will see that God offers us a way to be made righteous. God provides a way for that standard to be met. And look how the Apostle Paul describes it. He keeps going in Romans chapter 3. Look near the end in verse 22. He says this: "The righteousness of God is through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe, since there's no distinction. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." We have all sinned, and we are all offered the hope of being reconciled with God through what Jesus did. And so to understand the faith that Paul is describing when he says that the righteousness of God is through faith in Jesus Christ, he's describing a faith that first realizes the need for the mercy of God. It realizes that I need Jesus. It realizes that I have nothing to offer God of any value because of my sin. But that does not change God's value for me. I gotta hold on to that. I realize in those moments that I have nothing of value to offer God because of my sin, but that does not change God's value for me, for you. And that's why Jesus came. Jesus came because we are valuable to God. Even though we have done this to God, even though we have treated God this way, we are valuable to him as his creation. He wants relationship with us. And so Jesus was sent and he took on himself. When Jesus went to the cross, what he was doing, he was taking on our unrighteousness. He was taking on our sin. And as he was doing that, he was also experiencing the penalty of our unrighteousness, death. And so Jesus died, taking our unrighteousness, experiencing the penalty that we deserve. And then in that moment, as we see what has happened, we realize he did all this so that we could be justified, so that we could be made righteous before God. And recognizing that I do nothing to receive this except I come like the tax collector and I say, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I see the reality of my sin. I see who I am compared to you, how good and holy that you are. But because of Jesus, this is what we can say with confidence through the work that Jesus has done. Now, having met God's standard, for what is good, we are made acceptable to God. You hear that? Now, because of what Jesus has done, having met God's standard through Jesus, now we can be acceptable to God. This is what Jesus is helping us understand and see. But a parable like this, it begs the question, and we all need to ask this question. Maybe many times in our lives, we got to come back to it. Where are you looking to find your goodness for your righteousness before God? Where do you look to think that you can be made acceptable to God? Because unless we understand our heart's true sinful condition as someone desperately in need of God's mercy, we can't truly embrace what Jesus offers us and what he did on the cross. Unless we really understand the depth of our sin, its offense to God, how it broke our relationship with God, we can't fully embrace what Jesus did for us and what he offers us to be reconciled to God. And so the lesson for our lives is that we need a heart that prays like the tax collector and a desire to ask God to show us thinking like the Pharisee. We need a heart. We need to ask God, give us a heart. Give me a heart, God, that prays like the tax collector. And then ask God to show us when I am thinking like a Pharisee. You know, I have found this in my life. I didn't tell you this. I said at the first service, this is probably the most impactful parable that I've ever had in my life. Because there's something that I have realized, if I've come back to this at different seasons in my life, the more that we begin to pray like a tax collector, the more we're reminded of how we get to experience God's mercy every day. Sometimes we're afraid. We're afraid to be honest about our sin because we're afraid we're going to live in this judgment or guilt or condemnation. But that's not the point. The point is, as we realize I sin, we can cry out like the tax collector, have mercy on me. And then as I get to walk in the mercy of God, I realize that mercy is available to me every day. There's a verse that I'm reminded of that I come back to often. It's from Lamentations chapter 3. It says this, because of the Lord's faithful love, we do not perish, for his mercies never end. They are new for us every single morning. Great is the Lord's faithfulness. His mercies are new for us every morning. The more we cry out for his mercy, the more he offers it to us. We don't have to run and hide in our sin. We don't have to play comparison games and try to diminish our own sin. Instead, in those moments, we rightfully can embrace the reality of our sin, begging for God's mercy. Saying, God, I see it, and I need you. Will you meet me right now? As he offers us mercy and forgiveness, knowing that he is the one that makes us righteous before God. This is our hope. Because of what Jesus did, when we compare ourselves to God, it's not hopeless anymore. It doesn't have to bring us to that place. Instead, we are reminded of the mercy that he offers us every time we come. And then what happens, and I love this, then we not only live daily in God's mercy, we not only get to experience God's mercy, but when I look at others, instead of comparing to see sin, I want to offer them mercy too. Because when I see the real reality of my sin, who am I compared to someone else? But God has given me this amazing gift of mercy that restores my relationship with him. How much more can I offer mercy to people that are just as guilty as me, so that we experience the mercy of God together? Let's pray. Before we go to prayer, I think there's a question that's important to ask. Have you ever responded to God like the tax collector? There's always that first time. Or maybe are you at a place where you're still kind of trying to be good enough for God, trying to make things right, trying to somehow be the person you think you're supposed to be, hoping that will be enough for God because you go to church or you volunteer and you give money. Instead, I want to offer you this morning what Jesus offers us: to respond like the tax collector. Jesus offers us a way to be made right with God. And all we have to do is deny our goodness, accept his mercy and forgiveness for our sins that we've committed against him and others. And then what happens, this is the first step of experiencing God's mercy that God now offers to walk with us every single day in our lives. So if that's you, I just want to invite you right now, I'm going to be silent for a moment, to go to God. Jesus, I thank you that your mercies are new every morning. And that we are here not because of who we are, but because of who you are and what you have done. God, you did a miracle in our lives. You brought us out of a desperate place, offered us mercy. And now we stand here because of your mercy before a God that is the same God doing that work today, ready to do it in our lives now. As we commit ourselves to you, Jesus, we want to meet with you. In Jesus' name, amen. Be in the prayer corner if anybody would like to pray.